My name is Rizwan Mustafa, and this is my TED Talk on diversity, equality, and inclusion in the police service. Now, the catalyst for talking on this subject area has been a series of promotional posts that I've seen, particularly on my LinkedIn feed, on diversity, equality, and inclusion in the police service, and specifically images of what I would describe as Asian males and females wearing hijabs and with beards, in uniform, communicating, I suppose, two narratives. One, that the service has become far more progressive and inclusive, and secondly, when it's become progressive and inclusive, then perhaps it's worth considering joining the service for race and faith communities who historically perhaps wouldn't have done so. And when I saw these images, it got me thinking about my own experiences within the service, and how my experiences relate to the images that are being presented on mainstream media and social media platforms and professional linking platforms, and alongside some of the data that exists around the lived experiences of race and faith communities in the service. Now, my own experiences, in order to understand that, we need to wind the clock back to 2014, and specifically in 2014, what happened was that I was at work. I was working for a metropolitan police service, one of the larger metropolitan police services, and I was posted to the public protection unit dealing with adult abuse investigations. And on one particular afternoon, roughly about I think it was August, September time in 2014, I received a phone call on my mobile, and it was my wife's number that came up, but it was actually my daughter, my eldest daughter, who was 10 years old at the time, 10 years old. And I remember this clearly. She said to me, "Dad, Mom's collapsed and I don't know what to do." So I told her to try and stay calm, told her to get the house phone, dial 999, ask for the ambulance, and keep me on the phone as well and tell me what they say. I rushed home to find my wife collapsed on the floor, my eldest daughter around her, still on the phone to the 999. Paramedics arrived shortly, but also in the room was my youngest daughter, who was roughly 18 months to 2 years old, and my middle daughter, who was roughly about 5.5 or 6 years old at the time. Now, this was a unexpected incident. It materialized after months of treatment and consultations with specialists that my wife had developed a small blood clot on the back of her brain, which was pressing up against a nerve, and that would cause all sorts of problems when it was aggravated, and it would cause her to lose balance, lose consciousness, and become physically incapable of just maintaining her own self. And the situation was such that when we became aware of this as a more continual problem, that I needed support. I needed support from the service. I needed support from work to put me on a plan that meant that I could look after the needs and interests of my family whilst also still coming in to work, which compromised the shift demands and the needs of the organization, but these were unexpected circumstances, and this is where I found the issues around diversity, equality, and inclusion really fell down. Not because I had issues with the flexible working, but because I had issues with the entire process that supported that up until that time that the request was made. And in order to make a little bit more sense of that, it's necessary to wind the clock back a little bit further to roughly 2012, 2013, where I happened to witness an incident that I can only describe as racist and religiously discriminatory, which I challenged and raised with supervision. And from that point, my life became incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult in the sense that I was monitored the way that nobody else was monitored. I had to have supervision meetings the way that nobody else seemed to. My work was scrutinized more so than perhaps anybody else's, to the point where my supervision wanted to, after this point, put me on a unsatisfactory performance plan, because they were arguing that there were issues with my work. And to this point, I'd been in the service from 2003 and had never had issues with my work. In fact, I've had commendations from various different chief constables in relation to my work. So I found it really, really interesting. Perhaps is the most apt word to use. But generally, a picture was being painted that there were issues in terms of management, issues in terms of performance that needed to be structurally recorded and supported. And things like, what time I go on break, what time I come back from break. I remember on one occasion I left my radio in the station. I had a sergeant, 2 inspectors, a chief inspector, and a superintendent pick me up on leaving my radio in the station, all of whom had a conversation with me individually about it. And you begin to question legitimacy and proportionality at that point. How proportionate is it for 5 senior members of staff and senior leadership at superintendent rank to have a conversation with a PC about leaving their radio in the station, and whether or not that same conversation is being had with everybody else in the service who has left their radio at the station? Because you can absolutely guarantee that at some point in their career, nearly every police officer has done that. So these were some of the issues that were being kind of bubbling away from 2013, that found that the culmination of which resulted, in my opinion, around the refusal, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 separate applications that were submitted by me to the work strategy team, requesting flexible working to support my family based upon the circumstances that I had disclosed. And every time I submitted it, it was rejected. What would need to be the severity test? What would need to happen? How bad would it need to be for the service to turn around and say, yeah, actually, you know what, based upon what you've said, we can grant you flexible working? That, coupled with the issues around performance management and the constant scrutiny, and all of these things converged at a point where in May 2015, I was a defeated man. And I left the West Midlands Police and decided to go on a career break. Submitted a request, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I couldn't find any other solution, couldn't find anything else that could potentially work. And I decided to put my request in and leave. Now, when I left, I didn't have any other job to go into. There was nothing else waiting for me. There was no other career. There was no other job. There was no other source of income. In fact, the exclusive source of income was my salary from the service. So my funds dried up very, very quickly. And after my funds dried up, that period that I was out of work, I was washing cars, I was mopping floors, I was cleaning toilets, solely to look after my family so I could put food on the table, take care of their financial needs, as well as take care of their my wife's health and well-being as well, and look after my children. And now I looked at that when I saw the promotional adverts talking about how progressive we are, how diverse we've become. And I thought, well, maybe my experience was unique to me. Maybe it was just the fact that I ended up with, a couple of real poor supervisors who created this environment that was toxic for me, and it's not representative. My experience isn't representative of the broader phenomenon of operational policing for race and faith communities. And I wish I could tell you that that was the case, but the statistics don't really support that. The data doesn't really support that. And there's a lot of research that's been done since the Macpherson inquiry in relation to institutional racism, institutional bias within the service. And there's a lot of literature that people can read to understand that better. And a typical example is evident, for argument's sake, in the employment tribunal data that exists regarding faith and race and metropolitan police services. So across the 43 constabularies in England and Wales, from 2013, I believe, up until the present day, there's been 77 employment tribunals that have been logged against the service on the basis of race and faith. Now, 76 roughly equates to one every 30 days, one every 30 to 40 days on average, an employment tribunal And that doesn't mean the conversations that have happened internally within the organization. That doesn't mean the formal resolutions, informal resolutions, conversations, everything up until the time that it goes to an employment tribunal. This is relationships are broken down to such an extent that an employment tribunal has been lodged. Yeah, 76, roughly one every 30 to 40 days. When you look at the misconduct disproportionality for minority ethnic communities, faith communities, race communities, the College of Policing released some data in 2020, arguing that the number of officers that were dismissed between the 1st of April 2019 and the 31st of March 2020 were 12% BME, 78% were white. It's 12% BME in terms of dismissals, but the BME representation of police officers in the service as a whole is only 7%. So if you're a black and Asian officer within the police service, you're twice as likely, almost twice as likely, to get dismissed when your case goes to a misconduct panel. Twice as likely. And you've got to ask yourself the question, why? Why do these disparities exist? And there's a whole body of research that's been done that talks about, well, how do those cases arrive at disproportionality misconduct hearings in the first place? So when I look at my example and I think, well, was there legitimacy within that? Was there proportionality within that? Was it a fair crack of the whip? Was I incompetent the way that I had been presented to be? That would have justified my case arriving at a misconduct panel. That would have justified a potential outcome of dismissal based upon the arguments that have been built up in this space. And the interesting thing about this disparity, racial bias within the service, or the absence of diversity, equality and inclusion, which is the way that it's presented, is that it's not just an internal phenomenon. It doesn't just affect communities within the service, in the communities in the sense of all of those colleagues that are from faith communities or race communities, but it's also outward facing as well. And the Macpherson report is a product of a outward facing failure of DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion, following the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And that's where its principle, that's where its beating heart is. And this is evident in modern contemporary time. Within the pandemic, I think the MPCC issued some data fairly recently regarding COVID fines, breaches for COVID fines, and if you were from a minority ethnic community, you were 1.5 to 1.6 times more likely to receive a fine compared to your white counterpart. And the stop and search debate is a well-established debate. If you're black, then you're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched in England or in the UK compared to your white counterpart. And in London, in some places in London, it's as high as 43 times more likely. And you begin to kind of question that, well, if the service is, or if they're positioning themselves, broadly speaking, to be diverse, to be inclusive, to be equitable, then why do these disparities exist? Why is it the case that there are so many employment tribunals coming to the courts? Why is it the case that if you're from a minority community, race or faith minority community, you're twice as likely to be dismissed from the service compared to your white counterparts? Why is it the case that if you're black, you're still 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched? And if you happen to be a member of the BAME community, then you're 1.6 times more likely to receive a fine for breaching COVID regulations. Why do these disparities exist? Employers often ask candidates, whether on the application form or in interviews, what have you done to prepare yourself for this job role or interview? And I think it's about time that question was flipped around to the employers. What have you done as an organization, specifically in the context of policing, because we're talking about policing organizations, to embed diversity, equality and inclusion within your organization? What have you done to recognize me as an individual? What have you done to value my ethnicity, to value my race, to value my gender, to value my sexuality? All of the protected characteristics under the Equalities Act. What have you done to safeguard my interests within this organization? Because quite often, certainly from my subjective experiences, within the service, and based upon the research and the data that was presented earlier on, quite often the ability for me to achieve within the organization is curtailed by discriminatory practices, the absence of equality, the absence of diversity, the absence of inclusion within the organization. And diversity doesn't just mean that we have posters with lots of different color faces and different styles of dress on our promotional campaigns, or to support our organizational kind of positioning in the marketplace, but rather diversity means diversity of thought, diversity of identity, diversity of inclusion, diversity of social mobility, diversity in all the possible strands that can be conceived as diverse. And that's our greatest challenge, folks. For those of us who are joining the service, for those of us who are in the service, and for those of us who are exiting the service, how can we create an organization that is inclusive, that is representative of the interests of our workforce and our broader communities, not because it's a political agenda, but because it's the right thing to do. My name is Dr Rizwan Mustafa. I'm a director and head of research at Cal Marina. I'm a senior lecturer in policing, and I'm a specialist consultant to the Countering Violent Extremism Unit in the Commonwealth, as well as being an associate for the College of Policing. I speak at conferences internationally, and I advise governments on national counter-terrorism strategies. I am one of many minority community members who have exited the organisation, and after leaving the organisation have gone on to achieve fantastic things. I wasn't able to do so within the organisation whilst I was in the police service, but I'm hoping that that will change, certainly for the future generations and those coming after us.